Why is the chapel so important? The answer is really that it is not simply a magnificent Victorian building put up in 1877 to the designs of James Cubitt, the architect. It is a statement of the values and achievements of the Non-Conformist movement at almost the peak of its influence in Britain. After centuries of persecution, it finally came into its own in the late Victorian period, and the Union Chapel is one of the most magnificent statements of what it had achieved in that time. Non-conformism was the name given to Protestants who, for various reasons, could not join the Church of England. So they formed all sorts of different churches of their own, and they practiced their religion for several hundred years under a number of serious civil disabilities and discrimination, which were only lifted gradually in the late 17th and 18th centuries. The chapel started in 1799 when a group of Anglicans who had left the local parish church joined with a number of non-conformists, meeting in Highbury, and worshipped together. And by 1806, they had got on so well and made such a success of it that they built their own galleried chapel that could seat 400 people. How did we get to the present building from the 1806 chapel? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the nature of Islington and the nature of the leadership of the Union Chapel. In the first half of the 19th century, the population of Islington doubled until 1850, and then it nearly doubled again until the end of the century. The congregation of the Union Chapel more than doubled, and that was due to the very striking leadership of its main minister during the 19th century, the Reverend Henry Allan. In 1861, the capacity of the chapel was doubled to 800, but already by 1874, this was clearly not enough. So he and the deacons of the chapel decided to double the capacity again. And they could only do that by completely rebuilding the building. So they decided to create an architectural competition presided over by the famous Victorian architect Alfred Waterhouse. In the resulting adjudication, he recommended the designs of James Cubitt, an architect who had previously published a book about the design of churches, in which he advocated the then rather revolutionary thought that everyone should have a clear view of what was going on in the chapel. And the result was opened in 1877 and was an instant success. So what we've got in the committee room of the chapel here is the original Pewing Plan of 1877. We see a plan of both the ground floor and the gallery. And every one of the seats here, or at least most of them, would have been allocated to people who paid a small sum every week, which was known as a Pew Rent. And in this way, the chapel paid back the various loans that it had taken out to build the building, which cost a massive £50,000. But in fact, the loans were all repaid by 1895, and this is how it was done. For a small sum, you got an allocated pew, and when the pew was allocated to you, they would put a little pin in the plan which would show that that seat had been allocated. And I think it's a good way of making the point that the centre of action was, of course, the pulpit. But the architect had very carefully designed the building in such a way that behind the pillars there were no pews. So where there were pews, they all got a direct line of sight to the pulpit. Henry Allan died in 1892. After that, a number of factors combined to reduce the size of the congregation very significantly over the years. The population of Islington fell dramatically at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century. There was then the First World War, and the decline in the congregation, though fiercely resisted, nevertheless continued right up until the 1980s, at which time the then minister and congregation decided that they had to apply to pull the building down. This, however, caused such an outcry, not just among conservationists, but among the local population, that in fact consent was refused, and a new minister, Janet Wotton, had the idea that the building could earn its keep as a venue for arts performances. Some of the very features of the building, which James Cubitt had introduced, rendered it highly appropriate for an arts venue, particularly the line of sight and the superb acoustics that we now enjoy. And these started from the mid-1980s onwards, and in 1992 the Union Chapel project was formed. The project, which is chaired by Philip Walker, has been the sort of lifeblood of the chapel since the early 1990s. In normal times, anyway, we have reached the position where the project has kept the building afloat and works closely with the chapel and everyone else, so that the chapel is on a good financial basis and it is able to fund worthwhile local projects. Without that, it would be a very different story. As an institution, the Union Chapel is, I think, unique. Here is a fully functioning congregational chapel, fulfilling much of its original mission in a fabulous building which has found a new role in a new world. And very few places can boast that, and I think we should be very proud that we have one of the best here in Islington.